Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's ICAP Grand Rounds. We'll get started in just a few minutes. We're just allowing participants to join us from our virtual waiting room. I will just ask if you have joined and if you can indicate in the chat box your affiliation. That would be extremely helpful just for us to get a sense of who's joining us and from what country you're participating or US city. Great, so welcome everyone to today's ICAP Grand Rounds. It's the first of 2021 and it's our pleasure to welcome you. My name is Fatima Churis and I'm the Deputy Director of the Human Resources for Health and Training Unit at ICAP headquarters in New York. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our virtual Grand Rounds series. Just some housekeeping before we get started. We will be using the Q&A box for questions during today's presentation. So throughout today's session, please feel free to type in your question during the presentation, and we will respond to your questions at the end of the actual presentation. So again, please use the Q&A box for your questions. And the chat function will be used just to record your affiliations and countries that you're joining us from. So please ensure that you type in your title and your affiliation. Our session will be recorded and will be posted on the ICAP website. The link will be posted in the chat box at the end of today's session. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Andrea Low. Andrea Low is an infectious disease physician and a clinical epidemiologist. She is currently the clinical and scientific director on the multi-country PHIA project and is an assistant professor of epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health here at Columbia. Her research interests include HIV prevention in vulnerable populations and the heterogeneity of infection and risk, including among adolescents and young adults, as well as common co-infections affecting people living with HIV. She is also the principal investigator on studies exploring the impact of climate change on the health system, a topic we will hear about today. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Fatima, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining today. I am going to turn off my video just because my internet might be a bit unstable, but so I apologize. So today I'm going to be speaking about some of the direct and indirect effects of climate change on human health, with a particular focus on food insecurity and its associations with HIV infection. This headline was actually taken from the Washington Post just last week, where evidence, although there's some disagreement between the different models, it suggests that 2020 was either the hottest year on record or second only to 2016. What is particularly concerning, and what you can see in this image, is that on June 20th, 2020, the temperature in the Arctic Circle was hotter than it has ever been recorded. And this has been linked to projections of worsening temperature anomalies across the globe. At the beginning of 2021 as well, the LANCET published an update on their Lancet Countdown series, and this examines a number of different climate indicators. So the Lancet Countdown is an international collaboration established to provide an independent global monitoring system dedicated to tracking the emergency health profiles of the changing climate. This report presented 43 indicators across different sections, which looks at impacts and exposures of climate change, adaptation, planning and resilience, other forms of mitigation, and public and political engagement. As you can see from this headline, the indicators are almost all accelerating in a negative direction. Here we see direct effect of climate change on infectious diseases. This is from that same journal, the Lancet 2021, and we can see that directly impacted are climate-sensitive infectious diseases. These are namely vector-borne, foodborne, or waterborne. And we can see here in the upper left quadrant that dengue and its vectors, these two species of mosquitoes, have had a quite steep increase in vectorial capacity since 1950. We can also see that malaria, the number of months suitable for malaria in highlands, a way that they used to actually control malaria, these have all declined as well. So we have worsening risk for longer periods in a number of different settings. Also looking at these foodborne or waterborne Vibrio bacteria, you can also see that areas of coastlines have become much more prevalent, especially in northern climates, because of the warming of the ocean. Here, if we think about the indirect effects of climate change that might occur on infectious diseases, one of the first things to consider is its impact on food security. Multiple different projections and analyses have demonstrated that food security declines pretty steeply due to climate change. And this includes due to high temperatures, low rainfall, destruction of pollinators, and climate extremes. And here you can see, in also taken from the Lancet article, a decrease in crop duration growth in many key staples, including maize and rice over time. The state of the food security in the world is a release from the UN FAO that occurs every year. And you can see the results here in the first report from 2020. Here they indicate that the number of people affected by hunger has been slowly on the rise since 2014, after a pretty steady decline for several decades. They highlight that there's a particular risk in sub-Saharan Africa, where almost 20% of the population is undernourished. And you can see here that over half the population in Africa has some form of severe food insecurity. Now, this also was written before this endemic of COVID. And so they produced an updated report in September of this year to understand how much the COVID economic shock occurring from decreased travel across borders, shut down workplaces, and so on, how that might be impacting some of these countries in Southern Africa, especially those with really high HIV prevalence. And you can see that Eswatini and Lesotho both suffer from climate extremes, as well as the COVID economic shocks. But many of these other countries as well, such as Zambia and Zimbabwe and Tanzania, have increasing numbers of people who are food insecure. So, trying to examine this a little bit further, looking at the literature, you can see that back in 2008, there was a development already of a theoretical framework on how climate change might indirectly impact HIV. And so you can see here the multiple different mediators between climate change and HIV infection. They're predominantly social disruption related and behavioral changes leading to increased risk of HIV acquisition, but there's also the question of whether undernutrition leads to immune impairment and the potential for increases in risk of HIV acquisition. This was developed by Weiser et al. In 2011, and this really highlights the bidirectional relationship between climate change, food insecurity, and HIV. So it's not just that these structural drivers, including poverty, drought, flooding, drive food insecurity. And then you have these different pathways that can then impact either the risk of HIV acquisition or transmission. But you also might have those people who have to interrupt their antiretrovirals, and therefore they have increase in morbidity and mortality due to this food insecurity. But it's also been shown in several studies that those people with HIV might be more likely to also suffer from food insecurity because of diminished employment opportunities and in some ways restrictions on their ability to follow labor markets through migration. Here are a number of other studies conducted primarily across Africa, but also in the United States, examined how we might see a relationship between food insecurity and HIV risk. And one of the earlier papers here by Weiser, published in 2007, showed that women in Botswana and Eswatini, who were sampled in a cross-sectional survey in 2004-2005, had inconsistent condom use with non-primary partners. They reported increased transactional and intergenerational sex, and also more forced sex. And very interestingly, you do not see that association when you look at the same outcomes in men. If you look at the Carl Miller paper in 2011, this was restricted to 41 women living with HIV, but it was a qualitative study, and they found that women reported less control over condom use, increased in transactional sex, and in fact that they were more likely to stay in violent or abusive relationships due to food insecurity. They also noted that women's food insecurity dramatically worsened if the husband died, and that was particularly bad in families where they lost someone to HIV. In Pasco in Zimbabwe, in 2007, 18 to 22-year-old girls were followed and in a cross-sectional survey, and they found that in this young population, there was lower educational attainment, earlier marriage, earlier sexual debut, and older sexual partners and transactional sex. They also found a higher HIV prevalence in food insufficient young women. And finally, here in North America, they've looked at food insufficient men who have sex with men and found that it was associated with a variety of sexually transmitted infections, including herpes simplex virus 2, prevalent HIV, and illicit drug use. So this is a problem that expands across the globe. One of the seminal papers for our analyses actually came out in 2014, and this is a group of economists from Stanford who used data from 19 demographic health surveys, which included data from over 200,000 adults. And they used this to examine what local rainfall shocks might be doing in terms of the epidemic. And they were able to show that over this long period that, especially in HIV endemic rural areas, you would have an increase of 11% in HIV infection rates for every recent drought. They also explained through their model that 20% of variation in HIV prevalence across African countries could be due to these types of income shocks. So, this paper made my colleagues and I curious as to whether we would see a similar impact if we looked in an era where antiretrovirals had been more widely available. So we wanted to use data from the population-based HIV impact assessments. I know Professor Justman has spoken about these in the past, but if you are unaware of these surveys, we have these large nationally based representative samples. It's a PEPFAR-funded project, and it is taking place or has taken place in over 14 countries in Africa and Haiti. And data collection is actually complete for Zimbabwe on a second round in Lesotho, and we have a number of surveys that should be re-embarking on data collection or initiating data collection after a pause induced by COVID. It should be noted that we have trained an enormous amount of people to collect this data, and we now have data on close to 500,000 people in terms of adult interviews, and we have tested 420,000 adults and children for HIV as part of this project. The overarching objectives of the PHIA project are really to provide data on the impact of all these programs that have been rolled out over the past 2 decades in sub-Saharan Africa for control of the HIV epidemic. And the project goals primarily were looking at the impact of the rollout of ARVs and other forms of prevention through estimates of HIV incidence, HIV prevalence, and viral load suppression. And that was defined as less than 1,000 copies per mil. We were able to generate an annualized incidence by looking at the national rate of new HIV infections using the lag avidity assay, partnered with viral load and ARV data. And we were able to estimate the subnational prevalence of HIV and viral load suppression, as well as in some countries, the prevalence of HIV in children aged 0 to 14. The questionnaires that we used in PHIA would vary across countries, but there were some core modules that were included. And some of these were quite important to our analysis. We looked at crowding, for instance, so you could look at the number of members in the house. We used the assets to generate a wealth quintile, which was based relative on other people in their community. We also captured data on food insecurity over the past 4 weeks and economic support over the past 3 or 12 months. The individual questionnaire, which was administered to people aged 15 or older, collected quite a lot of demographic information as well as work history, and then sexual and reproductive history with a particular focus on the past 12 months and their last 3 sexual partners, as well as other forms of access to healthcare. It's also important to note for one of our studies that children's educational attainment was provided by the guardian who identified them as a parent or the legal guardian. Finally, we had 10 to 14-year-old questionnaire that also asked about knowledge and attitudes towards HIV, as well as sexual history. Here we can see a theoretical framework that was developed by several people on the team, where we paired some of these other frameworks that I previously showed to specific outcomes that we measured in the PHIAs. And you can see here how the various ways that climate change is driving both acute and chronic food insecurity, and how this might be impacted by these social structural determinants such as wealth and educational attainment, and how these might lead to these high-risk behaviors. We also considered migration, which can be a side effect of acute or chronic food insecurity, can lead to decreased in antiretroviral adherence and lead to lower viral load suppression in the community, which can then drive HIV acquisition. So here I'm going to present the short-term outcomes of this analysis, so primarily behavioral. And the first analysis that we did was looking at some of this data on drought. I found this map from the geospatial unit at the World Food Program, and they very kindly agreed to share the gridded data set that they used to generate this map with me so that I could do the analysis. You can also see from this map how serious the drought was in 2014 to 2016, where extreme dryness is common across almost every country in Southern Africa, with very few areas of normal, and then even those countries like Tanzania that were spared from the dryness had extreme wetness. Here you can see the negative impact on maize production, particularly stark in places like Lesotho, where it was at minus 67%, but also in places like Eswatini or Swaziland. So the Lesotho PHIA was conducted at the tail end of that drought. So we started data collection in November 2016, and we completed it in May 2017. And the thought was that because we ask about sexual behaviors over the past 12 months, this would capture some of the changes that might have been a result of the recent drought. Lesotho is a country within the country of South Africa. It has a population of 2.1 million, and it is a highly agrarian population with less than a third of people living in urban areas. It is also a young population with 24 years as the median age, and HIV prevalence is the second highest in the world after Eswatini at 24%. There is a lot of external migration, and particularly for the labor market, but also for educational and health seeking. People go to South Africa pretty commonly. And as I mentioned, it was conducted at the tail end of the drought. So when we originally overlaid this gridded data set on, over the geospatial map of where we sampled for PHIA, you can see that most of these areas had severe dryness, and there are very few areas where they actually had close to normal dryness. And we were actually quite worried that we wouldn't be able to find any patterns just for lack of a comparison group. And you can see here how small the ends are for the men and women in both the urban and rural areas. And we had planned a priori to stratify the analysis by both sex and urbanicity. So we were concerned, but then when we started looking at the data, we started seeing a really interesting pattern that certainly was supporting what we'd seen in the literature before and our framework. One thing that you could see is women in urban areas with severe drought were almost 5 times more likely to have a history of commercial sex, and they also reported a big history of increase in forced sex. If we restricted our analysis to the association between severe drought and behavior in young people aged 15 to 24, you can also see an unexpected pattern. So both boys and girls were pulled out of, had lower educational attainment in rural areas. This was not as pronounced as what we saw in the urban areas, but that was primarily for girls. Girls also in rural areas reported an almost 50% reduction in condom use at last sex. And you can see that there's a pretty similar impact on increase in intergenerational sex, and here transactional sex, which was classified differently than commercial sex, is just the exchange of sex for gifts. And we can see that also increased in young women in rural areas. Finally, when we restricted our analysis to those adolescents aged 15 to 19, with the consideration that they would have been entering the sexual marketplace during this time period of the drought, we can see a 3-fold increase in early sexual debut before the age of 15, early marriage as well. And we also found that there's a higher HIV prevalence in this age group. So we wanted to be able to expand this analysis. As I mentioned, there was quite a small comparison group, and we wanted to see if we saw these patterns elsewhere. However, the PHIAs were conducted vis-a-vis the timing of the drought at different times. And so in order to be more consistent, we decided to use something along the pathway of our theoretical framework and just look at food insecurity. We used the first 6 countries, which turned out to be in Eastern and Southern Africa, all of the countries where they'd actually collected data on food insecurity. So you can also see that it's quite a heterogeneous population across these countries in terms of HIV prevalence. So we thought that we would be able to run a relatively robust analysis incorporating this. And then we ran 2 analyses. One was looking at the correlates of severe food insecurity using logistic regression. And the other was looking at recent HIV as an outcome and looking at severe food insecurity as one of our exposure variables. We also wanted to explore a theoretical framework and see if we found similar patterns to what has been presented in some of these other papers. So here we can see the 6 countries that were included. They're Eswatini, Lesotho, Tanzania, Uganda, Namibia, and Zambia. And this was a total of 54,000 households that were included and 113,000 individuals aged 15 and older. And you can see that both Eswatini and Lesotho had quite high rates of people reporting any kinds of food insecurity. But then if you look at those people who'd received any kind of food support, it was much higher in Eswatini than in other countries. And in some countries, there's very little distribution of food, such as Tanzania. Now, we defined our exposure variable as no food in the house in the past 4 weeks, 3 or more times, so sometimes or often. And so we combine these variables for each country. And it's similar to the results we have above. You can see that the frequency of severe food insecurities is highest in Eswatini and Lesotho, but also has some increase in frequency here in Uganda and Namibia. Here you can see we mapped out food insecurity, and you can certainly see that we had very severe food insecurity in our high hyperendemic HIV locations, Eswatini and Lesotho, but in every country there were some areas of serious severe food insecurity and quite a few hotspots of it. If you look here, you can actually see our multivariable analysis for the odds ratios, and you can see that in terms of correlates of severe food insecurity, that a lot of the things you would expect were protective. So having a male head of household, increasing wealth quintile, higher education, being married, it was also protective, and employment. But it should be noted that having more dependents, being divorced or widowed, being a recent migrant, or chronic HIV infection were all associated with higher levels of, or higher odds of severe food insecurity. And the chronic HIV infection is particularly important just to support this idea of the bidirectionality of this relationship. In our second analysis, where we looked at recent HIV as our outcome, you can see here that severe food insecurity was associated with almost a 2-fold increase in risk of recent HIV in women, and all women aged 15 to 59. So we then looked at potential mediators, and we found that there was an increase in risk of transactional sex over the past 12 months, an increase in high-risk sex, which we defined as condomless sex with a partner whose HIV status is unknown or positive. Over long terms, we saw a history of forced sex or an early sexual debut. None of these patterns were apparent in the male analyses, supporting our framework. We also looked at intergenerational sex in young women and girls, and you can see that the pooled analysis shows a 63% increase in odds across these 6 countries in having a partner who is 10 years or older. And I won't go too in depth with this particular analysis. I think it just should be noted that Sarah Ayton and others have been doing an analysis across 8 countries looking at what the risk is based on the partner reported age. And we can see that even after adjusting for a number of other variables, the increased risk of recent HIV in, pardon me, in young women and girls compared to their same age band is 3.5 times risk for, for those girls who had slightly older partners in the 25 to 34-year-old age range, but there was quite a considerable increase in those of recent HIV in those girls who had partners in the 35 to 44-year-old age range. And what we found very fascinating about that is that if you have a 10-year-old partner and you get into the age band of 35 to 44, that partner is much more likely to be viremic, so not virally suppressed. And he is also more likely to have acute infection in that age band. So if we look at longer term outcomes based on our theoretical framework, one of the first things we really wanted to consider was food insecurity and the odds of having been pulled out of school. So Jessie Wong did this analysis for her thesis in 2018. And you can see here that children were more likely to not be in school if they were in a food insecure household. Adolescents were also more likely, but the effect wasn't as strong as for these primary age school children. And one of the biggest effects that we're seeing is female young children who had been sort of 60% increase in odds for not being enrolled in school. This is obviously important for a number of reasons, particularly economic, and but includes the health of families as well if you have decreased educational opportunities. But we also wanted to look at that question that has arisen in the past: is education, higher education, protective for young people from HIV acquisition? And obviously at different stages in the epidemic and in different contexts, that has varied considerably. In this analysis, Daniela Kiji is working with Elizabeth Gummerson to look at this impact across all these countries. And you can see that we have predominantly protective effects, both for male and female. And there is some slight variation by country, but overall the pooled variables are very similar for female and for males. For young people, with a suggestion of about 40% reduction in odds of HIV infection. We also wanted to look at population displacement, and although there was a small trend for increased recent migration, defined as having been away for a month or more in the past 12 to 36 months, we didn't see that wasn't significant for women, but for men it was, where there's almost a 15% increase in migration. We also wanted to look at food insecurity and viral load suppression, and some of that was based on other studies and a meta-analysis of these studies that showed that, particularly in North America, that there was a 29% lower odds of being virally suppressed in those who were food insecure. However, when we looked specifically at this and we looked at food insecurity and the odds of being virally suppressed, it was only in Uganda that we actually saw a significantly lower rate or lower odds of being virally suppressed if food insecure. However, if you look at the fact that many men who already have issues with viral load suppression in some settings, if you look at many of them were actually migrants due to food insecurity, both in Lesotho and in Namibia, we saw significantly lower viral load suppression in recent migrants. So almost 50%, or sorry, over 50% reduction in odds of viral load suppression in Lesotho. And here you can see a reduction for those people for significant migrants in Namibia. And a lot of that is being driven by not being aware of their status. So how can we mitigate against this? In particular, thinking about the incredible gains that we've made in HIV epidemic control and all the resources that have gone into that. I think it would be very tragic for us to lose all the enormous progress we've made in that area because of climate change. And so if you look, this is from a website in the UK developed with the World Food Programme. If we look at the 2050s, you can see that if we continue with high CO2 emissions and no adaptation, that there's going to be really high vulnerability to food insecurity across much of Africa, including in the countries with hyper-endemic HIV epidemics. Even if there's high adaptation and resilience policy, you can see that there's still quite vulnerable countries, including Namibia and Zambia and the like, despite this high adaptation process. And in fact, without additional efforts to improve climate resilience, it is estimated that the risk of hunger and malnutrition globally could increase by up to 20% by 2050. So if we think about potential interventions underlying our framework here, you can see we can directly address CO2 emissions and climate change. And there are a number of different ways to increase resilience to this, whilst also trying to decrease CO2 emissions. So greenification of cities is one of the big ones. Crop resilience is also something that's critical, trying to develop types of crops that can withstand high temperatures or dry conditions. And then there's also a lot of investment right now in agroforestry and restoration. If we want to think about underlying determinants, we can look at how to address structural determinants. And this is educational support. These can be aid to poor families or subsidization for more people in the community, really promoting the importance of education for young people within families, also employment assistance or microcredit to really help alleviate poverty. And finally, if we think about migrants and how to try and diminish this relationship between migrants and decreased viral load suppression, as well as the potential for increased HIV acquisition, you would want to be able to look at targeted prevention methods, really identifying those people who are most at risk, either of desperation migration, which can entail desperation sex, or other areas where you want to look at how to maintain those people's health while traveling. So migrant-friendly clinics in destinations where there's no stigma for being foreign, and then multi-month dispensing of antiretrovirals or of prevention methods like PrEP. One of the other things to consider, though, is that if we look at our model again of recent infection in women aged 15 to 59, as we said, there's an association with severe food insecurity. But what we also found that's really interesting is that there seemed to be a potential protective correlate in those families who had received food support in the past 3 months. So you can see here almost a 65% reduction in the risk of recent HIV infection in those families that had received this support. And what's very interesting is that you don't see it, though, in those who'd received other types of economic support. And so the literature certainly supports that. It's not universal, but in many settings, it's ideal for women to be able to manage the food support being given directly to them, particularly because they are often the ones who have to figure out how to feed the household. Whereas men who might be getting economic support might be leading to alternative uses of grain or other food products, particularly if they have concerns outside the household. So another potential use of these data are something that I've been exploring with people at the Earth Institute, including Teresa Yamana Sashi, Kandula, and Jeff Shaman. The idea of the early warning system was first proposed back in the 2000s, where people, as I mentioned, were observing these associations between high HIV prevalence and food secure areas. And so the idea would be if you could potentially use this very robust data set of the PHIAs and look at whether monitoring food security and livelihoods of families might be a way to determine where you might be developing transmission hotspots. So this would incorporate migration and displacement data and should incorporate various sources for viral load data, both clinical and some estimates of any attrition from clinical care, to understand where we might be having community levels of high infectiousness. And I think also, if we can validate the data on food support and its reduction in risk, then it should be part of any kind of targeted prevention, especially to women. So what are the interpretation of our results and our next steps? Food insecurity seems to be associated with increased recent HIV or HIV acquisition in women, and this effect was attenuated in men. Food support does appear to be protective, and economic support in general is not. We do want to validate this data using other sources, particularly longitudinal studies, because of this issue with bidirectionality and also how difficult it can be to show causality in cases of cross-sectional data. We are doing further analyses on different types of economic support and HIV-related behaviors and outcomes. This is in part being led by Elizabeth Gummerson and Danielle Okiji. We also have a mixed method analysis that we're starting to do, looking at health system resilience. The first countries that looking at Mozambique and the cyclones that occurred there in 2019. And there's also consideration of how to use modeling to determine what the potential projections would be in terms of food insecurity, the HIV pandemic, and potential scenarios for climate change. So I wanted to say thank you first to all of our partners. These PHIAs are an enormous endeavor, so I can't mention everyone who's involved, but as I show here, there are a number of different partners who have contributed enormously to the PHIAs. On our paper, we have a number of people from icap and Mailman, UCSF George Rutherford. Very honored to work also with Rogerio Bonifacio and Claudia Apo from the World Food Program, as well as colleagues from the CDC and various ministries of health. Finally, I wanted to highlight the work that I've been doing with a number of people here in the early stages of their careers. This includes Jessie Wong, Naklit Teferi, Leah Gweke, Natasha McLeod, Sarah Ayton, Susie Martinez, Alea Khalifa, and Tom Carpino. They've all contributed enormously to this work and to other projects that we're launching. And I know that they're all going to have a very impressive career in public health, but I also wanted to encourage them to stick with the climate change analysis, obviously it being one of the key threats to humankind right now. So thank you very much for listening. I'm just going to see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. There were a few questions that came in to the Q&A section, and I'll invite participants to type in your questions.
Yes, so I can answer first for Chun Fu Yang. When I did the multivariable analysis, we did adjust for, we didn't have data on the annual income, so we just had the wealth quintile that we had to derive from household assets. So it is obviously an imperfect measure of individual wealth or comfort, but we did also think a lot about how communities and the wealth within the community might also impact whether women found alternatives to transactional sex or behavioral changes. So it is a very important question, thinking about how it might be confounding. Now, the next question from Dr. Patricia Ann McLean is, it showed an age range of 15 to 59. Yes, the age 15 is considered adult in these 8 African countries, not legally in terms of consent. We always had to get assent from parents to include them, but they, based on demographic and health surveys, this is the standard at this point, is to consider young people 15 and over as adults, particularly in terms of analyses around HIV. Finally, Katrin Kreis, thanks so much for a great presentation. Thank you. I'm curious to know your perceptions on how open PEPFAR is to look at the intersection of climate change, food insecurity, and HIV. That is a very good question. I think, as we know, we also have a change in administration occurring, and I think the new administration is certainly very interested in trying to mitigate climate change. So I don't know if that might impact keenness on evaluating this, but I do think that the findings on food support are so striking, and there's such a wealth of data out there right now in terms of how HIV might be intersecting with poverty and the like, that I would hope that there would be more interest in trying to support further analyses. Great, and then from Philippe Maillot, can all the migrations due to climate change be modeled? Which origin and destination countries, and how can planners be encouraged to include HIV acquisition and care mitigation? What should they do, and how can they be supported? Thank you, Philippe. You can do the modeling, and I think that is in fact part of this discussion I've been having with some modelers at Bristol. Incorporating any kind of migration into these models can be quite difficult. you can generate estimates of how many people are positive and unsuppressed just based on some of the data that we have on PHIA. But it can be very complicated. And if you don't have good data on movement, population movement, then your assumptions are going to be quite suspect. Okay, anonymous attendee, maybe I missed it, but how is food insecurity defined and distinguished from hunger or undernutrition? This is a great question. We do have quite a few different ways to measure food insecurity. We found that this one question about food in the house for the past 4 weeks correlated the best with other measures of impaired socioeconomic status, so wealth quintile and education. So that's why we stuck with that as one of our indicators. Okay, I see Aaron Z. Previously, food supplementation was available in PEPFAR countries using BMI data for distribution. I believe that this was discontinued. What are the resources available to assist going forward? I think this is a similar response to the other one. We'll have to wait and see how the new administration deals with PEPFAR and food support, but I do know what was very interesting, and as I noted, the fact that viral load suppression was not adversely impacted by food insecurity suggests that some of these programs that target people living with HIV in terms of food supplementation are probably quite effective in reducing treatment attrition and so on. So I guess watch this space. I have high hopes that that we might be able to convince people that food supplementation will be particularly important at this stage, considering COVID as well. Great. Have you researchers working in Mozambique? We are implementing a food security nutrition project for people living with HIV suffering of climate change. I would be delighted to follow this project. So thank you for sharing your email. I will reach out after this. It sounds really fascinating. Yes, if you finally, I saw that some of your confidence intervals for your ORs were pretty wide despite having an N greater than 16,000. Thinking particularly ORs associated with intergenerational sex. Do you have folks who have some ideas as to the reasoning behind the wide range? So it depends on the outcome. We do have, certainly we went with Poisson regression for the recent HIV infection analysis, just because the number of cases there is quite small, and that can explain some of the wide confidence intervals for those. If we want to look at the intergenerational sex and age band, what was very interesting is that, especially for 35 to 44, even over those 16,000, there's still a relatively small number who did report having had sex with that age band. So that can sometimes cause unstable estimates. But we do hope, as we have so much data now for PHIA 1 and PHIA 2 that we can always look at further data and see if we can improve our precision.
Andrea, there was one additional question in the chat box. I'll read it aloud. It's a point around the adolescent girls and young women and partner recent infection. It sounds like the 30 to 35-year-old male partners might be more virally unsuppressed and cause recent infection in adolescent girls and young women. Have you measured the strength of the mediators? Which mediators had higher impact?
So, great question. For that particular analysis, we did look at a number of different mediators and included them in our final model as well. And one of the main mediators that we looked at was whether, as I mentioned, these partners tended to be more infectious because they were more viremic. And so if you consider age, why is it at risk? There's both the biological thought that, as I said, these partners are more likely to be infectious. Then there's also the behavioral thought, which is that girls are going to be less able to negotiate condom use with these older partners. So in that, we did in fact look at a number of different correlates of whether people were correlates of intergenerational sex and this possibility for increased recent HIV. And it does seem that most of the effect is because of viremia, but because there is still an indirect effect after we adjust for viremia, it seems that there probably are these behavioral things as well.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes remaining, so please feel free to type in any last minute questions. I'll also just respond. The slides as well as the recording will be available on the ICAP website for those who had indicated interest in receiving the slides. So please check back. Great, if no other questions, I'll just take this opportunity to thank Andrea for her really eloquent presentation highlighting the importance of the intersection of climate change, food insecurity, and disease vulnerability and acquisition. I think this is a lot of information and food for thought as we start a new year implementing programs and understanding the importance of DSD models, not only for HIV program implementation, but also thinking about food insecurity issues as well. So thank you again, Andrea, for this great presentation. We do have a very exciting lineup of Grand Rounds webinars for the year. So those will be posted shortly on the ICAP website as well. Thank you again, everyone, and also take this opportunity to wish everyone a healthy 2021.
Thank you very much, everyone.